All right, today I want to go over IUI cycles or Clomid cycles. And really the importance of this is understanding the timing of how things happen. So when we talk about IUI cycles, and typically you'll hear them called Clomid IUI cycles or letrozole IUI cycles, what happens is the patient will call the clinic when they get their period. And that's what we call menses, or their menstrual period, or their last menstrual period. And they usually typically call on day one, and we label that as cycle day one. Now, as soon as they do that, some clinics will bring a patient in for an ultrasound to make sure their uterus and ovaries look fine. Others don't. It just is really clinic preference. But what's important here is understanding the timing of how this works. So as soon as a patient calls with their period, typically the clinic will prescribe Clomid or letrozole, and it's typically written for 5 days, days 3 through 7, 4 through 8, 5 through 9. So you can see when the patient calls with their period on cycle day 1, they need to get their Clomid relatively quickly. So when they get their prescription for their Clomid, they take it for 5 days. At that point is typically when the nurse is also sending the prescription for Ovidril or HCG, the trigger shot, and that's to help trigger ovulation. That's going to be over here. But the patient takes this for 5 days, and then what you see is on day 10, 11, 12, not always, but usually a clinic will bring a patient in for an ultrasound, and based on the size of the follicles on the ultrasound and how the ovaries look, the patient will be instructed to take their HCG injection, or known as the trigger shot. That's typically around day 10 to 14 of the cycle. And then 36 hours later, they do the IUI. And that's what an IUI cycle calendar can sometimes look like. Now, this is the important part that I want to tell you guys, because it starts with the menstrual cycle. So let's say cycle day 1 is on a Friday night. So a patient gets their period on a Friday night. They typically don't have the ability to call the clinic on a Saturday or Sunday, so they call on Monday, which now gets them already to cycle day 4. So they can get their prescription for clomiphene citrate or letrozole, usually sometimes from a local pharmacy, sometimes it's through our specialty pharmacies, but they have to get started on this right away, and they're already cycle day 4, and by the time they get to cycle day 4, you've got about 7 days to get them their HCG injection, and therefore we have to work quickly. And getting prior auths done, getting it through the mail order pharmacies, overnighted to the patient can take time, and this is why we can sometimes get into a time crunch when it comes to patients. There's a lot of reasons. They get their period over the weekend. They get their cycle and they order the Clomid and letrozole, but they forget, or not necessarily forget even, just are waiting till they have their ultrasound on day 10, 11, 12, and then they want their trigger shot right away. The nurse gives them the instructions that day in the clinic, hey, you need to take your trigger shot tonight or tomorrow night, and they haven't ordered their trigger shot yet. And so when we go through this process, this is understanding the timeline sometimes of why early preparation helps us get patients their medications on time, but how sometimes that calendar can get shrunk and why we have to work quickly sometimes to get those prescriptions out the door.